Okay, let's keep going.
2. The power of language. In postmodern thought, language has enormous power to control society and how we think, so it's inherently dangerous. In 1967, Jacques Derrida published 3 texts of grammatology, writing and difference, and speech and phenomena, in which he introduced a concept that would become very influential in postmodernism, deconstruction. In these works, Derrida rejects the common-sense idea that words, signifiers, refer straightforwardly to things in the real world, the signified. Instead, he insists that words refer only to other words and to the ways in which they differ from one another. For example, his style of thought would argue that a word like house can only be understood in relation to the words hut, smaller, and mansion, larger, or building site, place where a house might be built, and empty lot, place where a house isn't, and that beyond these kinds of comparisons, the word house has no meaning. This is what Derrida meant in his famous and often mistranslated phrase, "There is nothing, read no meaning, outside of text." Additionally, for Derrida, the speaker's intent has no more authority than the hearer's interpretation. If someone says that certain features of a culture can generate problems, and I choose to interpret this statement as a dog whistle about the inferiority of that culture and take offense, Derridean analysis would deny the possibility that my offense came from a misunderstanding of what had been said. This comes from Derrida's use of Roland Barthes' concept of the death of the author, a literary theory that removes the author and their intent from consideration when analyzing a text's meaning. Derrida's solution to keeping discourses from creating and maintaining oppression is to read deconstructively by looking for internal inconsistencies that reveal a text's true intentions when the words are examined closely enough or with an agenda. Deconstructive approaches to language often look like nitpicking at words in order to deliberately miss the point.
Okay, so the power of language, to me, this is one of the ones that I think has really served as a disrupting force in how we interact with each other in today's age. And that is that we have not only unplugged meaning from intention in words, but we've also raised language to weapons and conflated actual violence with words so that you can now justify retaliation for language with actual physical force. And these things combined have really disrupted the way that modern discourse happens.
It's the whole punch a Nazi debate when Richard Spencer got hit. It's a debate with people. And them explaining to me, like, all I see is you defending Nazis. And I'm like, look, I remember learning about free speech when I was younger and realizing at some point, you're never really going to have to defend pleasant speech. Nobody's ever going to try to take away your ability to say nice things about people. They might, I don't know. But
now we can. You can't say nice things about problematic people because then you'll be branded with that.
This last week, I saw some people say some nice stuff about Joe Rogan, and they had to go because it just advances on and on. But
and it's so funny that you bring up the example of the punch a Nazi thing, because to show how far we've gone, where these ideas have transformed some of the institutions that we used to rely on to defend liberalism. One of the major defenses that the ACLU ever raised was in defense of American neo-Nazis to have a parade.
This is a bit of history which may be unfamiliar. In the 1970s, a tiny American neo-Nazi party group of 20 to 30 people targeted the town of Skokie, Illinois for a march and demonstration. This was a deliberate target, as Skokie was home to the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel, men and women who had lost family and loved ones and themselves survived the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. The prospect of men bearing swastikas and Nazi uniforms marching down the peaceful streets of Skokie ignited harrowing memories of the past. The reaction of the town of Skokie was completely understandable. The city board enacted 3 ordinances to prevent the neo-Nazis from demonstrating. One to require an insurance bond which was so high that no insurer would ever accept it, to prevent any demonstration portraying racial hatred and other hostilities, another which banned the distribution of literature promoting racial hatred, and another which prohibited demonstrations by individuals wearing military-style uniforms. Faced with these new city ordinances, which essentially blocked their party from holding a demonstration, the neo-Nazis received help from a very unlikely source, the American Civil Liberties Union, whose attorneys, themselves Jewish, represented the leader of the neo-Nazis, Frank Collins, in suing the government for his right to free speech in holding a Nazi demonstration. It was a controversial move, Jewish lawyers representing Nazis and defending their right to free speech. Through great resistance in the community and on the national stage, the ACLU and the Nazis ultimately prevailed, and the city ordinances were overturned as violations of the First Amendment. The rally, though moved from Skokie to a location closer to Chicago, went forward. Although the tiny faction of neo-Nazis was far outnumbered by the thousands of counter-demonstrators who showed up to express their opposition to the ideas of hatred espoused by the Nazis. Despite this controversy, despite the loss of members, the loss of donors, and public sentiment that the ACLU suffered as a result of its decision to defend the Nazis, the ACLU leadership and lawyers at the time maintained that the defense of the right of free speech, even and especially speech that is disagreeable and offensive, is a vital part of the larger project of working towards justice for all and defending against government overreach and tyranny.
A week ago, one of my constituents came up to me and said, I hear that you're going to make a speech to the ACLU, and I hear those people go around debating communists. And I said, oh no, you've got it wrong. They claim communists and socialists, fascists, atheists, racists, segregationists, members of the Ku Klux Klan. The fellow said, well, it sounds like a mighty nice organization.
People get up and say, Norman Siegel, you're the lawyer for the Klan. And I say, no. We represent the Klan, but I'm the lawyer for the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is for everybody.
The ACLU is supposed to defend the free speech of Nazis. They're supposed to defend the free speech of Black Panthers. Why else would we have an ACLU?
And just so, I mean, I know the answer to this, but I think it'd be worth hearing it from you, just for people who aren't as familiar with the history. I'm looking back on that controversy and kind of the trajectory of U.S. politics since then, 40 years later, with a lot of talk about white supremacist groups and neo-fascist groups and the like. Is that a decision that you regret? Is it something that you still to this day believe was the right decision? And if you were the head of the ACLU in 2020 and were faced with a similar choice, would you make the same decision?
Absolutely. And it's important for people to understand there's a strategy here. This is not, some ivory tower, philosophical, pure, unrelated to reality decision that we make in our own heads. There is a real political strategy in a decision like this. The political strategy is that it's too dangerous, especially if you're a vulnerable minority. It's too dangerous to allow the government the discretion to decide who should be allowed to speak. I mean, think of who the people would be who would be making those decisions. In my teenage years, it would have been Joe McCarthy. It would have been Richard Nixon. Do people today want Donald Trump and William Barr to be deciding who should speak? Who do you think is going to be hurt by it?
Or their judges, right? Or the judges appointed by Donald Trump or George W. Bush.
Exactly. I mean, when the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law prohibiting speech, abridging speech, or freedom of assembly, it means that even if the entire democracy, 100% unanimously in Congress, all 535 of them, decide that you shouldn't speak, they don't have the power to do that. And that doesn't protect the establishment. It protects vulnerable minorities.
Fast forward to the modern critical social justice-infused era. In 2017, the ACLU was confronted with a new sensibility towards its historic policy of a radical defense of free speech. It all starts in Charlottesville, Virginia.
The chaos in Charlottesville had been building for months. Since the city voted in April to remove the Robert E. Lee statue, there have been 3 protests, counter-protests, and more violence.
Surely Charlottesville is a lot like Skokie.
This is clearly about white supremacy, and we're not going to have it here. The rally in Charlottesville supposedly was generated by the movement to pull down statues.
White supremacists wanted to demonstrate near a Confederate statue. Robert E. Lee, one of the Confederate leaders, was in a very central position in that town.
Organizers of Saturday's planned rally had said it was meant to honor history and save the statue.
In fact, I think it's pretty clear that white supremacists were looking for a way to flex their muscles.
At the very last minute, after the permit had been granted for the August demonstration, a member of the city council sought to move the demonstrators.
We are not backing down. We're going to be in Lee Park.
Of course, it stirred old memories.
These people are trying to replace us with third world immigrants. They are trying to replace us with Muslims, talking down to white people, trying to make us to blame for everything.
There was an attempt to get an injunction to stop the demonstration in Charlottesville, and on its face, that's really no different from the scope of the situation.
That's what led the ACLU, together with some other organizations, to oppose that, saying that it was a viewpoint discrimination. It was only because of hatred of the ideas of the white supremacists that there was this effort to move them away.
I'm a woman. I feel very strongly that those are really horrible, horrible people with noxious ideas. But there's no question in my mind that they had an absolute right to demonstrate under the American Constitution.
White supremacists, to the horror and unpreparedness of all law enforcement agencies, showed up the night before the rally, marching through campus, brandishing lighted torches. I woke up listening to the radio and hearing, is the first thing I remember hearing when I woke up, was the chants of the demonstrators. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. And you can imagine the chills that sent down my spine as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
You will not replace us. You will not replace us.
What happened in ensuing days is not the fault of free speech or the people that champion free speech. What happened in ensuing days was the fault of the police and the government for not providing ample protection.
Police say Fields used his car to intentionally mow down a crowd of anti-hate demonstrators on Saturday, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer.
When Heather Heyer was run down by an automobile, there was literally not a single police officer in that vicinity at all.
I guess my question, and I'm not trying to be contentious for the sake of it, it's an honest question. If people show up with guns and clubs and they're chanting, Jews will not replace us, at what point is it fair for a Jewish person who comes from a culture that people have been hunted and killed, at what point is it fair for them to feel like violence is imminent?
Oh, no, they can feel that. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of that is symbolic. When people burned flags, they got arrested for inciting violence. When people carry guns in a demonstration, in a society where they're allowed to carry guns, you got to make a distinction between speech, including symbolic speech, and conduct. Now, the difficult question is, where does the speech bleed into conduct, and at what moment do the police step in?
Is it fair to have a concern that if hate speech incites violence, that you should control it?
Well, you know, the key phrase there is incites violence. You have to remember that in Charlottesville, the instrument of killing was a car.
That's right.
The police did a poor job of anticipating and protecting speech of both sides in a volatile situation. The police have to be good enough and competent enough to anticipate a volatile situation and protect the rights of both sides to speak, but keep them separate and have enough of a show of police force to prevent the chaos that happened in Charlottesville.
In the weeks after this conflict, critical social justice activists turned their attention towards the ACLU and began applying their approach to social justice towards the ACLU directly, asserting that those who facilitate the exercise of free speech for oppressive elements are themselves complicit in the harm to the oppressed.
Thank you all for coming out tonight to Students in the First Amendment, presented by the ACLU and Alma Mater Productions.
Claire Castañaga joined the ACLU of Virginia in June 2012, bringing with her decades of experience as an attorney, lobbyist, nonprofit leader, and fundraiser.
So, tonight I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ACLU, who we are, and what we do. Good. I like this. This is good. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about knowing your rights and protests and demonstrations, which this illustrates very well, and I'll appreciate it. And then I'm going to respond to questions from the moderators, and then any questions that there are from the audience.
ACLU, you protect Hitler too! ACLU, you protect Hitler too! The oppressed are not impressed! The oppressed are not impressed! The oppressed are not impressed! No justice, no peace! Nazis don't deserve free speech! No justice, no peace! Nazis don't deserve free speech! Revolution will not uphold the Constitution! Revolution will not uphold the Constitution! Liberalism is white supremacy! Liberalism is white supremacy! Liberalism is white supremacy!
If people are interested in talking about, is that not possible? Is conversation not possible? I mean, I've heard you and I hear you. Is conversation not possible?
The event description for this open discussion says nothing about the ACLU's controversial decision to help white supremacists sue Charlottesville. The tragic events in Charlottesville are only the latest in the ACLU's long legacy of being on the wrong side of history. By hiding behind the rhetoric of the First Amendment and free speech, the ACLU has provided a platform for the most extreme forms of white supremacy. When is the free speech of the oppressed protected? We know from personal experience that rights granted to wealthy, white, cis, male, straight bodies do not trickle down to marginalized groups. We face greater barriers and consequences for speaking. The ACLU and liberals believe that legality determines morality. Not too long ago, the Constitution dictated that Black people only count as 3/5 of a person. The Constitution cannot be your moral compass. In contrast to the ACLU, we want to reaffirm our position of zero tolerance for white supremacy, no matter what form it decides to masquerade in. When the President of the United States refuses to condemn brutal violence committed in the name of genocide against Black people, indigenous people, and people of color, it is unacceptable to actively provide a platform for those who perpetuate it. To those of you who disagree, we want to remind you, Black lives matter.
In the wake of these events, it appears that the ACLU has recalibrated its approach to the issue of free speech to incorporate considerations of power dynamics, hierarchies of oppression, and marginalization into its approach for new clients.
So you were head of this organization for 25 years almost. I mean, from 1978 to into this century.
Right.
It's changing. I mean, it was a stalwart defender of free speech and civil liberties. Is it still that?
Not as much. I mean, they just produced a couple of years ago new guidelines for their lawyers to use when deciding what free speech cases to take. This is a requirement now for the national ACLU lawyers that before they take a case defending someone's free speech, they have to make sure that the speech doesn't offend or threaten other civil liberties values. In other words, before they're going to defend your free speech, they want to see what you say.
And
that's the ACLU? No, that's the government. What is the ACLU doing?
I read that quote. Then the phrase was values contrary to
our values.
Our values, but your value is free speech. Yeah. I mean, the most famous case, you defended the Nazis being able to march in Skokie, Illinois in 1977.
Right.
Okay. I'm guessing the Nazis did not reflect your values.
That's a good guess.
Right.
Actually, most of the speech we defended didn't affect.
Of course.
That's what it is. That's the point.
That is the point.
People used to say to me, isn't it hard to defend free speech when so few people in this country are in favor of it? And my response always was, no, that's wrong. Everybody's in favor of free speech, as long as it's theirs.
Right.
And everybody has an exception. Everybody says, well, I believe in free speech, but...
Right, and it doesn't work if there are exceptions. No. I mean, can I show a quote from the current head, Anthony Romero? I'm sure you're familiar with this gentleman. He said, I reject that we need an entrance exam on civil liberties to establish the bona fides needed to work here. What? You don't need an entrance exam on civil liberties in an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union? Would you like to address him directly?
If you're hiring a lawyer to defend the First Amendment, you want to have a reasonable assumption that he likes the First Amendment, that he supports the First. If you're hiring,
or knows about it.
How can, if has become, not totally, this is not 100 to nothing, but they've become more of a political, partisan, what they call progressive organization.
Right.
Now, organizations have the right to change. They can do that. But the problem is there isn't any other ACLU. And if there isn't somebody who's prepared to defend what you say and prepared to defend what the Nazis say and prepared to defend what people for abortion say and prepared to defend what people who are against abortion say, then the government gets to decide who can speak. And that's the most dangerous thing of all.
And the idea then was that you have to protect expressions of free speech in your society so that the atrocities that happen when totalitarian takes over do not repeat themselves.
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech. Now, you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
So no one ever understood Derrida. And that's part of his Andy Kaufman game, because nobody can understand people if words don't matter anyway. And he would purposely word it and put things in his books. He has 20 books. A guy has 20 books who says you can't understand any word I say. He has a lot of different live speeches, and he has a lot of his stuff was about live versus written word and how meaning gets lost in that. But if you tried to ask Derrida what deconstruction is, he'd say, I don't like that word. You know? And then you say, so what is deconstruction, Derrida? I'll tell you what, it's not a methodology. It's not a thing. And he was notoriously trickstery like that. And so if you try to pin it down at all, you can, in a Derridian way, diabolistically just get torn up anyway, trying to pin down any sort of word and its meaning, trying to describe Derrida. So in a weird way, he's playing the meta game to prove it to you that none of us can understand each other. And
sounds like listening to a lawyer who doesn't want to get pinned down to any word, because then that's a standard by which they have to actually defend or refute something.
It depends on what the definition of the word is.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's like interesting ideas in that. If I say the word umbrella, the three of us all probably thought of a different umbrella. And there's interest in that idea. Maybe you can play around with it or something like that. But as far as he goes with it, I think he gets a little bit ridiculous. But once again, there's ideas of it to run with and play with. It's just, he was really going with ideas like that come out of structuralism, like Roland Barthes is a structuralist. And post-structuralism was just taking structuralism to its extreme, in the sense of, not only when I said umbrella, did you guys, maybe all three of us thought of a different umbrella, but already a couple minutes later, we've all thought of different umbrellas. And so we can't even
Well, hold on. You gotta back it up, because when you say structuralist, you've already lost me. They didn't define that in this book, and it's not in the required reading.
Yeah, the structuralists are, so Derrida is considered a post-structuralist. Structuralists are people who really focused on language. I think they did mention it a little bit, that they were focused on language and literary theory and how words related to other words, and the relation of other words was how we understood what words were. And so they already answered Derrida's question. Derrida undid what they answered. They answered, I understand which house you're talking about in the relativity of the sentence. Like, the sentence has these other words that helps me realize you're talking about that house. And Derrida ran with it and said, no, even those relative words don't help. It just forever gets deferred. Like, you'll never land on the actual concept of what the house is. Derrida played this like game that he said, if anybody can bring me a signified into the classroom and give me a signifier, which is signified is the thing you meant by a word, and then give me the word that means the thing. It's like, you can bring me your house cat and take it to Derrida and say, this is my cat. And he'll say, I'll deconstruct that. And if you could actually pull that off with me, I'll give you an A in my class from the very, very start. And it was his little game that he played, just saying that, no, we can't ever fully understand each other of what this exact thing is. And I don't know that he necessarily proved that. There was a long famous debate between him and Searle, Searle, and Searle debated that just intentionality just wipes it out. The person's intention of what they're trying to talk about obviously points to something that you're definitely talking about. Maybe your idea's there. If, like, I say the word house, the three of us all have a different perception of house, but I can refine that down so you guys know which house I'm talking about.
It sounds like linguistic nihilism. There's no point in even communicating once you disconnect the idea that you can communicate anything, which to me sounds like a philosophical defeasibility, which is like the philosophical equivalent of falsifiability. It's that, just doesn't make any sense, because you can't even convey the language to explain that is real if you say that language cannot explain anything. So it's inherently contradictory and therefore is meaningless.
Maybe I'm missing something here, but it seems like it's very easily falsifiable, in that it feels to me like the fact that if I was trying to get to your house and you explained to me where it was and I got lost and I asked you to explain further and you explained further, the fact that I could find that house that you're talking about almost feels like it completely throws that theory on its head. And I don't know if I'm missing something about it.
Yeah, which would tend to let you think that it's a bunk theory that is more sophistry than something which actually brings us closer to truth.
It's wordplay and it's hair splitting, because, like, even Derrida might say that if I gave you the descriptions of that house, you still interpreted them slightly differently than how I saw them in my brain. And we can never fully understand exactly what each other one of us saw, even though practically you got there. But that's the games he'd play. And then it got worse if you take people and applied it, did a heuristic, which is go and apply it to things into the world, and saying that all these categories, all these things, nothing can really mean anything except for what the individual or each different person tries to place upon it. And that's where you get the fully radical constructivism, the full concept of everything's just a game in our heads.
Okay. I don't know. It seems to me that in spite of what would seem to be the most extreme in terms of ridiculousness and detached from reality, it nevertheless had the most effect in terms of how it has modified, shaped, and endangered the way that we interact with one another.
Yeah, and it overlaps with Foucault, because Foucault said it's all there in discourse. And then Derrida says that then the discourse really can't be fully understood between people. And it really is really burning down the barn all the way.
But what do they save? Because I feel like what they save is if you've deconstructed language so that the speaker's intention is no more authoritative than the hearer's interpretation. Now you've elevated the hearer's interpretation to the level of truth. So now if somebody believes that what you said is really a racist dog whistle that we can now use to demonize you, delegitimize you, and deplatform you, then that is as actionable as anything else. And furthermore, if we could say that your language was literal murder or literal, this is that trope that is you're literally killing me with your words, or you're literally fomenting youth suicide by advocating this particular thing. It removes your ability to disprove that or to respond to that.
Yeah, I'd say the whole entire concept of microaggression is changing something that was probably intentionally not an aggression. It was intentional. Normally something like commenting on somebody's hair or asking where you're from has an intention of trying to be polite and nice or even interested or curious in society. And they've changed that to a concept of, no, it must be an aggression because that's just what we're going to call it. It's just shifting words around and putting negative attention on them. But of course, if you go all the way back to the postmodern and not the applied postmodernists, a defender of Derrida would just say, you didn't understand.
It's funny because we see the same sort of two-facedness with this, where people who put these things in their toolkit and then go about the critical social justice activism will eventually say something that will put them in the crosshairs. But then they'll immediately turn to that age-old defense that we all want to have, which is, you misinterpreted what I said. I didn't mean that. I was taken out of context. And the thing is, no, you don't understand. If you play with those tools where what you meant or what you intended does not matter, then that is a sword that you will die by. And that's where there's a real danger in just going head on into this. If you're involved in a community and this idea that what you intend in what you say does not matter, then that's a red flag. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be thoughtful about your language and your audience, but it's not an extreme where there's no connect between intention and what interpretation of the hearer.
I would suggest as well to anybody interested, go try to read Of Grammatology. Go try to read Writing Difference. Read it just cold and see how much good you get out of that. If you try to read it, just go try to read it. Just go try to read it and ask, why is this our God? Derrida had 18 different professors of ontology decry him and say that he should have his scholarship or his credentials as an academic removed because his philosophy and theory was so garbled and strange that it didn't merit being part of academia.
When Derrida was proposed for an honorary degree in Cambridge in the UK, this provoked a fierce polemic about the value or valuelessness of his work. The following extract from a letter published in the Times in May 1992, signed by an array of intellectual philosophers, is quite restrained compared to some of what was promulgated at the time. Quote, "Many have been willing to give M. Derrida the benefit of the doubt, insisting that language of such depth and difficulty of interpretation must hide deep and subtle thoughts indeed. When the effort is made to penetrate it, however, then it becomes clear, to us at least, that where coherent assertions are being made at all, these are either false or trivial. Academic status based on what seems to us to be little more than semi-intelligible attacks upon the values of reason, truth, and scholarship is not, we submit, sufficient grounds for the awarding of an honorary degree in a distinguished university." Smith et al., 1992. The claim here is clear. Derrida should not be taken seriously as a philosopher. Moreover, his work is dangerous because it undermines the values of reason, truth, and scholarship, and by implication, it is ethically nauseous, nihilistic, and corrupting. This has been echoed more recently by those who have seen a clear line leading from the academic querying of universalist truth claims to the flagrant propagation of falsehood, lies, and unsubstantiated allegations in our modern post-truth political era. Some people seem to think that Trump is all Derrida's fault.
Well, that's the other thing is the people whose names really stand out in history and activism, you get the sense that they are these gods, that no one could ever refute them. But examples like that, where there's plenty of people who've pushed back against it, should give you some heart that you can push back against them even in today's world. Is there something to rescue in Derrida if you were going to be as charitable as possible? I remember being lectured to by my English major daughter about when I was trying to push back on a new use of a term with an expanded definition. She said, languages evolve and languages change. So you can't just assume that your old understanding is the right way of thinking.
Yeah, things evolve, but I do think there's interest in asking, are we being clear? Are people understanding us? Or are we talking past each other, or even viewing the world in the same way? But he's so nihilistic about it that if you ask me, when I started grad school, it was just barely after Derrida had died. And one of the very first articles we read was people singing Ding Dong, the Witch Was Dead, because he had taken over, especially that deconstruction was like a very useful thing for people to write 1,000 literary criticism papers to just publish and nobody was ever going to read them. But we could take that deconstruction and go read Shakespeare now. We could take that deconstruction and go read this and just make papers and papers and papers out of it. And maybe there's always some sort of interest in like reading any sort of words or sentence in a Derridian way and seeing like what maybe underlining ideas might be a person's ideas, or reading like literally it can be useful or interesting to just think about this text in your own way and not even care about what the intention of the author was.
Yeah.
But Roland Barthes also probably even worded that better. So now I guess I got to be as charitable as I can to Derrida. As charitable as I can. I think the world would be better if Derrida was never.
That's a form of charity. What is charity really? Let's deconstruct charity. I don't know. I feel like that whole let's deconstruct this and then followed up, what is this really? And then trying to break it apart into its components and then nullify its existence by determining its various parts at their fundamental levels. I feel like that has just been extended into so many different things. We don't only deconstruct words, but we deconstruct the concepts behind the words and the institutions and the people behind that. And it gets taken so far into such an extreme that it's one of my triggers now of the word deconstruction. Let's deconstruct this. Let's deconstruct that. Because I feel like it's generally a prelude to a subversion of something that you would otherwise accept as normal or conventional. But we haven't even gotten too much into how the concept and idea of normal and conventional is in of itself a form of power and oppression. But that's the underlying theme through there.
Oh, if I was to say one thing about Derrida to rescue him is I don't think he intended it to be such a major supersonic cultural problem. That's some charity.
Oh, okay. He didn't intend to deconstruct the foundations of Western civilization.
Yeah.